Good evening and welcome to the Hoffman Forum. My name is Jill Dupuy and I'm the Beaux-Arts Director and Chief Curator here at the University of Miami's Low Art Museum. I'm also a member of the Hoffman Forum Working Group, which means that I have the distinct pleasure of working with colleagues at the University of Miami's School of Law, co-sponsor of tonight's program. On behalf of the Law School and the Low, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Loyal Canes and Law School alumni, Deborah and Larry Hoffman, for so generously supporting this and related events. Operating under the aegis of the Law School's graduate program in Entertainment, Arts, and Sports Law, the Hoffman Forum provides opportunities for examining and discussing issues involving law, public policy, the arts, and social justice. Thank you, Debbie and Larry, for your generosity and for your vision, which includes sponsoring this evening's Hoffman Forum Civil Conversation, Cultural Patrimony in the Kingdom of Benin, Critical Considerations. In recent years, museums and other cultural institutions have begun examining their collections through lenses of decolonization, legal compliance, ethical best practices, and cultural sensitivities. They have also increased the frequency with which they have returned objects to source nations, including Nigeria, within whose modern borders regal and ceremonial artifacts were taken from the ancient kingdom of Benin in 1897. These are the foundational elements of this evening's discussion. Moderated by Dr. Sarah Clunas, this civil conversation was expressly designed to bring together leading experts from a range of fields to explore the most pressing issues related to the Kingdom of Benin's cultural patrimony. Conceived as a springboard for expansive thinking rather than a prescription for specific or narrow courses of action, this dialogue promises to surface key legal and ethical, as well as cultural considerations in a productive, collegial manner. Before introducing Dr. Clunas, I would like to note that tonight's program will be recorded and within the next week or so will be made available online to all. I would also like to add that CLE credits are available for members of the Florida Bar. The law school will be forwarding CLE details to all attendees after our proceedings tonight. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Clunas, Director of Academic Partnerships and Curator of African Collections at Harvard University Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Originally from Kingston, Jamaica, she received her PhD in art history from the University of Iowa in 2006. Dr. Clunas has taught art history for over 20 years at public universities and historically Black colleges and universities. Her research has focused on the history of African art and the display of African objects in Western museums. She also studies the influence of African aesthetics and philosophy on the arts and religious rituals and cultural identities of the African diaspora. Dr. Clunas, whose work examines gender, race, and migration in multiple contexts, has published in both national and international magazines and journals. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Clunas.
Thank you, Jill. I am going to take the mic. Welcome, everybody. I would like to acknowledge that this gathering is being held on the traditional lands of the First Nations of this continent, and to pay my respects to elders and ancestors, both past and present. It is important to acknowledge presence. It is important to recognize sovereignty. We are here tonight to talk about the Benin bronzes, and I would like to give you a little bit of just a summary, although it definitely won't cover everything, to just introduce you to the topic and some of the issues that we will be talking about tonight. So the Kingdom of Benin is the home of the Edo peoples, and it is not to be confused with the country of Benin, which used to be Dahomey, and in 1975 changed its name to Benin, which borders what is present-day Nigeria. The Kingdom of Benin is located in the southwest region of present-day Nigeria, and it has been renowned for the extraordinary quality of its royal arts, commonly referred to as the Benin bronzes. Not all of these royal treasures are, in fact, bronze. They are mixtures of copper alloy, coral beads, ivory, terracotta, wood, iron. Now, traditionally, and still today, sacred guilds would oversee the creation of these art forms in Benin City. In 1897, during a British raid on Benin, The royal palace was burned and looted. And Oba, the term Oba is used for king in both Benin City and in Yoruba culture. Oba Ovan Ramwe was exiled. All the royal treasures that at the palace were confiscated during this raid. In Nigerian history, this is often referred to as the Anglo-Benin War. We in the West often refer to it as the 1897 British expedition. These treasures were taken by individual British officers and found their way into the British Museum or were sold at auction in London that same year. The estimated 3,000 objects that were forcibly taken from the kingdom that day eventually made their way into museums and private collections around the world. Today, we meet with 4 panelists to discuss current issues of repatriation and how international law and museum ethics affect the social lives of these objects, known as the Benin bronzes. So I would like to start with some introductions. We are very lucky today to be in the presence of 4 very, very special people that will be able to really illuminate for us. Not only, I think commonly these issues are talked about in terms of ethics and often legal aspects. Most people are very confused about the legal aspects. And so we have a number of different panelists today that are going to be able to shed light on a number of different issues. So I'm going to start with Dr. Sylvester Okwanodo Ogbechie. He is the professor of African and African diaspora arts in the Department of History and Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow for 2022. His research focuses on modern and contemporary African art, cultural informatics, and the arts and cultural patrimony of Africa and the African diaspora in the age of globalization. He's the author of Ben Nwanwu, The Making of an African Modernist, Making History, African Collectors in the Canon of African Art, and founder-editor of Critical Interventions, the Journal of African Art History and Visual Culture. Thank you for joining us, Sylvester.
Thank you.
Inotie Ogbebor is a self-taught multidisciplinary artist. He was born and currently lives in Benin City and Lagos, Nigeria. His interest in art was nurtured by his childhood, spent on Igun Street, witnessing his uncle and other bronze casters at work. He was apprenticed during school holidays to the late master carver Igmad Benekaro in Benin City. He is an authority on Benin court art and history. He also plays a very active role in efforts for the restitution of ancient Benin bronzes and artifacts, which are in the possession of foreign museums. He's the head of Nosona Studios, which is a vendor organization affiliated to the Smithsonian, and also a studio for training fine artists to preserve traditional artistic techniques of the Benin court. Inotie also heads Edo Global Art Foundation, a platform for the development of multidisciplinary artists. He is a steering committee member of the Benin Dialogue Group, and he is also director on the board of the Legacy Restoration Trust. He has worked to commemorate the centennial of the British. In 1997, he worked to commemorate the centennial of the British invasion of the Benin Kingdom. And Inotie is currently preparing for a solo exhibition at the British Museum for 2021-2022 at the end of his current residency program at the University of Cambridge. Inotie, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's late, and Inotie is joining us from London. So our next guest, Dr. Anna Filipa Verdoljak, is the UNESCO Chair in International Law and Cultural Heritage. She's the author of International Law, Museums, and the Return of Cultural Objects, and editor of the Oxford Handbook on International Cultural Heritage Law with Francesco Francioni, as well as a number of other publications by Oxford Press. Anna is the president of the International Cultural Property Society in the US and of the Management Committee International Journal of Cultural Property. She has been Fernand Braudel Senior Fellow, Marie Curie Fellow, and Jean Monnet Fellow at the Law Department of the European University Institute in Florence, and a visiting scholar at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law at the University of Cambridge and Global Law School, New York University. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Law from the University of Sydney. Kevin Gover is a citizen of the Pawnee tribe of Oklahoma. He served as the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and its George Gustav Hay Center in New York City from 2007. He also oversaw the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland. He led the museums to pursue equity and social justice for Native people through education, inspiration, and empowerment. And the museums have worked to expand people's ideas of what it means to be Native American. Currently, he is the Undersecretary for Museums and Culture at the Smithsonian. The Office of the Undersecretary for Museums and Culture oversees the institution's history and art museums and its cultural centers and the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian exhibits, and the National Collections Program. Anna and Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today and shedding light on the legal aspects of this very important issue.
Pleasure.
So I'm going to start. That was a long introduction, but it's because all of our panelists have done amazing and wonderful things. And so we're very lucky to have them here with us. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start with a question for Sylvester. Sylvester, I would love to know a little bit more about what it was like to grow up in Nigeria, your family's cultural connections to Benin City, and the oral histories you heard from your grandfather about the 1897 expedition. And as a major scholar in the field of African art history, your considerations about the importance of the bronzes to the Benin Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to Jill Dopey and the organizers of this event. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen. So that's my grandfather, James Anasibokwen Obeche. We kind of estimated he was born sometime around 1880, and he died in 1986. He was actually in the court of the Benin King when the British invaded in 1897. The current king of Benin is Oba Ewere. We see him here, and that's an example of the kind of artworks we're talking about here. A bronze plaque from the Benin Kingdom showing the king as warrior with attendants. And here you have a photograph of Oba Overanwe after he had been deposed and surrendered to the British in 1897. Note that the three military personnel that are standing behind him are actually African auxiliaries of the British Army. And then the image on the right is white British troops, with the loot from the palace of the king after the palace was taken over. That small Aquaman leopard, you see the butt of that leopard right there, is in the collection of Queen Elizabeth II. And that expedition, went with anthropologists who actually were sorting out all these works. These are bronze plaques that were being sorted in the palace of the king, right after the invasion. I just wanted to put these images out there just to let you know we're not talking about, these are historical issues, and they are very, very specific material realities behind them. These soldiers, these anthropologists, for example, you can see that they're sitting inside the palace complex, which had been burnt. The palace walls remained, and that gives you a sense of how sturdy the architecture itself is. The roof has been burnt over. So that's my grandfather, and that's my elder brother when he was taking his chieftaincy title in 1987. 1977, not 1987. And this item that he's holding in his hand here, you can see similar items on the altars of the Benin kings. We call them osisi, which is actually a name derived, from the original source. We used to send carvers, to source these objects from Benin when anybody wanted to take a title where I come from. So that's the basic, story. The point I'm trying to make with all these images is to explain that the invasion of Benin and the removal of these objects was actually something that had very material implications for the individuals that were affected by it. My grandfather fled the kingdom after the kingdom was defeated, but he couldn't come home straight away because certain kinds of laws forbade him from returning to his hometown after he left the kingdom. He lived in the forest for 6 months before he was finally found by one of his uncles, who then brought him back to the village. And his father, basically found him back in the village, having survived that Benin invasion. But still, because his father was king, he could not he could not stay in the village while his father was alive. It was taboo for him to return to his hometown while his father was alive. So his father sent him to his cousin in another town, which meant he was exiled, to the town I call my hometown now is where he was exiled. And his cousin gave him land there, and then he started rebuilding his life. A lot of other things happened around it. So Benin artworks are very important. Their importance is not just in the way we look at them as cultural objects that are the subject of repatriation and related kinds of discourses today. These are artworks that undergirded a whole way of life. Enote is actually from Benin. By definition of the British and the anthropologists who define the history of this region, I can no longer be seen as somebody having any relationship to Benin City, because my hometown is about 35, 40 miles away from the capital of the city. But these histories were undermined and turned upside down literally by that invasion, because my grandfather, who was actually there in the kingdom when this happened, when you asked him what happened, that day that the British invaded, he said the world turned upside down. Literally, that was his way of saying it was a major calamity. Things kind of really fell apart in a very fundamental way. So when we're studying Benin artworks and we're studying these issues about repatriation, we need to be thinking about the fact that those images of British troops, sorting through the pile of loot in order to distribute them to one place or the other. We're talking here about a massive relocation of wealth from the Benin Kingdom to the West. Now, when we discuss these bronze plaques and their return today, there seems to be this kind of logic hanging around them that thinks about it in terms of doing Africans a favor. But the point I'm trying to make here is we're already talking about, the colonial enterprise in Africa was a massive process of resource extraction and wealth extraction from the African continent, which, has in many significant ways, gone to enrich the colonizers in ways that we can actually point to today. The objects are not dry objects in that regard. So when I was a young person growing up, as a young man myself, I lived in Benin City for a couple of years. And when I was a young person growing up, where I lived in my hometown, which, as I said, is very close to Benin City, the kingdom was an ever-present kind of, it was an ever-present entity. If you lived in what we call the Asaba regions of Nigeria, which is, on the western side of the Niger River, through the history of my people, through our cultural practices, through our festivals, all those links to the kingdom are reiterated on an annual basis. And the kingdom is an ever-present kind of entity in the social imagination, which meant, of course, that being able to live in the kingdom, and observe many of those ceremonies contributed in very many ways to my deciding to become an art historian. I actually started out as an artist, and all that contributed in many ways to my deciding to become an art historian. I was fortunate to have known the previous king, and he has encouraged, much of this work that we're doing, which is to try and get a better understanding of the way that Benin art functioned within the kingdom and in academic context, so that we can gain a broader understanding of how these subjects operated when we're trying to talk about them. And I think the restitution issue is also impacted in this same manner.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sylvester. We're going to have more time to speak in a roundtable format. Mm-hmm. But I think one interesting thing was, I guess I didn't realize that your family was really displaced, and therefore, you sort of it sort of severed your connection to the physical land and place as well.
Yeah,
so that was
cost us a throne and our hometown, in essence. So that's what I got out of the invasion, basically.
Yeah. So Enote, tell us a little bit about your work as a contemporary artist. the media that you work in, and how your life and work relate to the traditional guilds from the Benin Kingdom, and what the absence of the bronzes means for you and other artists working in Benin City.
Thank you very much. Good morning from where I am. It's very interesting to hear the background which has been, and the linkages as espoused by Professor Obeche. To show, this just goes to show how expansive this subject can be. As an artist, I work, I paint, I sculpt, and I also perform. For me, creativity has just always been like a way of life. And I found that my works have taken on the form of my voice. They help me to say the things I want to say in a very graphic, pictorial, and intriguing manner, which, and I focus basically on espousing the culture, because it took me about 2 decades or more to come to terms with the reality of my culture and displaced history because of the 1897 invasion of Benin. So I do a lot of work to showcase the culture and the traditions, to situate them into this context. I also do a lot of my work to focus on environmental issues, because as you know, our forests have been decimated and a lot of animals are going extinct because of this uncontrollable forest practices. And so drawing attention to this debacle, and all this also accelerated after 1897 when colonialism was put in place and game hunting became a sport, so to speak. Before then, there were the forest and the cycle of life of the ecosystem was always preserved in that sense, because there were seasons where you couldn't hunt. There were taboos against hunting pregnant animals. There were things that were put in place to ensure that the cycle of life was preserved. But all this got destroyed after 1897. And then also social issues that touch on migration, illegal trafficking especially, to examine the socioeconomic issues which have become so powerful that they defy all taboos and cultural practices and traditions of our people. People are so desperate, they would go through the desert and cross the Mediterranean in flimsy boats to try to get into Europe. And this has resulted in a lot of loss of lives of a lot of young people from Benin. Over 80% of those being trafficked from Nigeria are from Benin City, from Edo State. And so it's a scourge which we have been fighting, and which has been yielding a lot of positive results as well. Apart from being an artist myself, I work with oils on canvas, I work with acrylic on canvas, I work with textile, I work in bronze, mixed media. I also do digital art and record music. This has led me to establishing platforms which also afford younger artists, and we have about 20 resident artists at the Edo Global Art Foundation, which is located in Benin, right opposite Igun Street, which is the quarters for the casters. Incidentally, my mother is from Igun Street, so I spent a lot of my childhood years visiting with her to see relatives and to play with my cousins. And we all ended up in the backyard or in the courtyard, making sculptures from clay and firing them with twigs and leaves, dry leaves, to make terracotta. And I thought, this was how every child grew up, until my teenage years, when I realized that this was a specific practice. But also growing up, the stories we were fed, which led to the invasion of Benin being called the punitive expedition, was that the British were coming on a mission to see the Oba, and they were ambushed by overzealous chiefs, and this led to retaliation. But in 1995, thereabouts, I came across books and publications which pointed to the fact that it was premeditated as a result of the Berlin conference, when European countries, about 13 or 14 of them, came together to partition Africa and divide it amongst themselves with a winner-takes-all mentality. And it was meant to be exploited. The minerals, the human beings, and the territories were meant to be annexed as part of territories belonging to these European countries. And so Benin Kingdom fell under the territory earmarked for Britain, and the intrigue and all the maneuvers to take over the territory were in full force. And so it was premeditated, and there were evidence, there were documents from the parliament to show that this was the case. And so for me, it became an interesting journey to begin to unravel these secrets and to bring it to the awareness of our people, and to also get involved in organizing restitution of these objects, and to bring about discussions about reparations, restitution, and not just restitution of these objects, but the restitution of knowledge, restitution of dignity, restitution of economic power. All this had to go hand in hand, because we were emasculated when the British took over in post-colonial rule, and resulted in the situation where we are today. And so this is part of what we try to pass on to the young artists who come to intern in our studio. We introduce them to the traditional art practice, visits to Igun Street, expose them to our history, to our culture, to the nuances of our art. And so, for instance, people might look at my paintings and think, oh, the perspective is wrong. No, I'm not using the perspective of Western art, but the perspective of plaques, which do not respect the principle of the further you are, the smaller you appear. But the larger you are on the pictorial plane, just shows in relation to whoever is in front of you, shows the relevance of your social status or your importance. And so it's a different kind of art guiding principles, which we try to imbibe into our work and to also share with our fellow artists. We try to organize residency workshops. We encourage them, young artists, to sponsor them for residencies, for art exhibitions. And yeah, this has been going on now for 6 years. And we've been very happy to collaborate with the Smithsonian, with a lot of other international organizations.
And now you're collaborating with the British Museum, is that right?
Yeah, yes, now. And now, collaborating with the British Museum, we've been sending young artists on programs to intern, to learn about museum practices and
great.
Other aspects
that's
of
wonderful.
The sector. Yeah, thank you.
This is really great, Inotie. I also wanted to share with the audience that Inotie often, he's taken me on a tour of Igun Street on WhatsApp, if you can only imagine. That was a lot of fun. And I was able to see, people working on really beautiful art objects, on bronzes. So thank you so much, Inotie. He's also the person who helps me the most with my pronunciations of Edo, which is I still struggle with, but thank you for your patience with me.
You're welcome.
I wanted to turn to our legal representatives and museum representatives to ask some questions that I'm sure we're all incredibly curious about. So, Anna, I had a question. This is something that I don't even really know, and I have sort of been really steeped and sort of in deep, if you will, in this on this particular issue for quite some years. But what were the international laws regarding the removal of cultural property in 1897? What was legal and what was not legal? What was the looting of Benin City considered legal in terms of international law in 1897? And then after you touch on that topic, I'd love to know a little bit more about how those laws differ now from what they were in 1897.
Thank you, Dr. Clunas, and thank you to the Hoffman Foundation of Forum organisers for this opportunity to be part of an important and timely panel discussion, and thank you to the other panellists as well. In determining the legality or otherwise of any act in dispute, we consider the applicable law at the time and place, as is inferred by Sarah's question. And often in restitution claims, the possessors, whether it be a public collection or a private collector, have often argued that the acquisition complied with the applicable law at the relevant time, or that there was no applicable law, that there was a lacuna. For the last century, this assessment has been made on the basis of a particular interpretation of international law, particularly the laws of armed conflict, assumptions about the relevant domestic law and legal system where the events occurred. My intervention this evening will only discuss international law issues without discounting the applicable laws and customs of the Edo peoples, covering their cultural patrimony, in particular the objects looted by the British. Prior to the 19th century, European authorities and the modern law of nations particularly appeared to indicate that pillaging of cultural objects during war was permissible, a position driven by economic imperatives of European powers and their trading companies. By contrast, there are normative examples from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and under Islamic law, which prohibited the targeting of objects of spiritual and religious, or rather cultural significance. During the 19th century, a consensus emerged in international law textbooks published in the United States and in Great Britain that state papers, so public papers and archives and records, should not be removed by combatants. Whilst jurists agreed that the destruction of cultural objects was contrary to the modern law of war, there was less clarity around looting. But before I elaborate on the laws of war during the sacking of the Benin City in 1897, let me highlight some of the characteristics of the development of international law during this period in the leading textbooks and judicial decisions. The diversity of traditions and practices in international law beyond European tradition that I mentioned, which were recorded in early textbooks, gradually disappeared and were replaced by the push for a uniform notion of international law, defined and implemented by a select group of countries, so-called civilised nations, generally European countries and settler states, and beyond them to a handful of countries such as Japan and the Ottoman Empire. The codification of the laws of war was a priority in this drive to standardise international law, to humanise the manner in which armed conflict and belligerent occupation was conducted and limit its impact on civilian populations. Included in this consistently was the protection of cultural property and the prohibition against pillaging. Included amongst this was the Lieber Code, which was adopted by the US government during the Civil War in 1863, and the Brussels Declaration of 1874. And I'll mention that date again, 1874, which precedes the sacking of Benin City. The Brussels Declaration was adopted following the Franco-Prussian War, and it prohibited the targeting of works of art, libraries and scientific collections. And also the Brussels Declaration strictly prohibited plundering by victorious armed forces. It's interesting to note that recent historical research has uncovered British reticence to the Brussels Conference because of any efforts to regulate naval warfare. So that's not surprising. The first binding multilateral treaty was the Convention on the Respect for the Laws and Customs of War on Land of 1899, which is known as the Second Hague Convention, and the Fourth Hague Convention of 1907. And their respective regulations reiterate the wording of the Brussels Convention, that is, the prohibition against pillaging during armed conflict and belligerent occupation. It is important to note that Great Britain was a signatory to both of those conventions and is a state party to them. Why are these treaties important? These binding obligations adopted by Great Britain reflected the crystallisation of norms that were evolving during the course of the 19th century. Indeed, as early as the second decade of that century, British diplomats and representatives denounced the removal of cultural and religious objects by Napoleonic forces throughout Europe and sanctioned their return during the Congress of Vienna. The Hague Conventions were also important because they were found to represent customary international law by the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg following the Second World War. The defendants in those proceedings were found to have violated the laws and customs of war, including by their systematic confiscation of cultural and religious objects during belligerent occupation. The court's findings mean that the prohibition against pillage is applicable to all states, not just states parties to the convention. That prohibition was reiterated in the Geneva Conventions, their additional protocols in 1977, successive statutes of international criminal courts in the late 20th century and early 21st century, including the Rome Statute of the Permanent Court of the International Criminal Court, which sits in The Hague, including the Specialist Treaty on Protection of Cultural Property during Armed Conflict, the 1954 Hague Convention. The International Court of Justice has referenced these treaties' provisions when ordering parties to return cultural objects. However, it is important to note that these treaties do not have retrospective application. So international law on armed conflict, as it was being formulated by European powers, was clearly crystallising at the time of the sacking of Benin City in 1897, including the protection of cultural property and the incorporation of prohibition against pillaging. However, this lack of clarity also extended to the application of these emerging norms. And it's probably not going to be surprising to all present that, and I'll read out part of a expert excerpt from a 1914 edition of the British Manual of Military Law, which makes it clear that humanitarian measures only covered warfare between civilised nations, and I'm quoting here, "The operation of these rules were explicitly excluded from applying to war with uncivilised states and tribes, and their place is to be taken by the discretion of the commander, and such rules of justice and humanity as recommended by them in the particular circumstances of the case." So as I've mentioned, in the early 19th century efforts to codify the laws and customs of war have deeply influenced the language and the parameters of international humanitarian law as we know it today, and international criminal law, which defines accountability for breaches of IHL. This covers a prohibition against the destruction, including damage and illicit traffic in cultural property, which has repeatedly been reaffirmed from the 19th century. And has also been reaffirmed again in successive Security Council resolutions from the 1990s, including a specialist or dedicated Security Council resolution of 2017. The latter recognises the illicit trade in cultural objects from conflict zones and occupied territory is a threat to international and regional peace and security, and UN member states and civil society must collaborate in its suppression and facilitate accountability and restitution efforts. It is important to recall that the legality and morality of the destruction of and removal of cultural objects during colonisation, including during armed conflict and belligerent occupation, has repeatedly and consistently been refuted by the affected peoples. What has changed? There is little doubt that the changing global economic and political landscape, which is significantly being redefined, has opened up an engagement which has been refuted or ignored in the past. We see this in various European countries and in holding institutions beyond Europe, including the Smithsonian, which Kevin will tell us about. New technologies have enabled the proliferation of platforms through which people can receive information and disinformation, unfortunately, and have diversified the voices being heard. Stories and histories which have been silenced or marginalised are re-emerging. How does this relate to the law and legal considerations? Having an appreciation of the facts concerning any dispute is vital to assessing legal considerations. It is also vital to understand that the applicable law, the range of international law practice and scholarship today has likewise been diversified. There is a growing critical understanding of the development and application of international law norms over the last 2 centuries. As I mentioned earlier, from the earliest examples in modern international law of prohibitions against the taking of cultural objects, by combatants during armed conflict and belligerent occupation, there has been a commitment to reversing these acts through restitution post-conflict, from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to the Security Council in the 21st century. The United Kingdom has played a central role in this. What has not always been clear or consistent is the application of these rules to the United Kingdom itself. And I'll leave on that note.
Anna, that was so fascinating. I'm still stuck on this civilized nations. And I wonder no surprise at all, but I wonder, was there any kind of definition?
Oh, of course. Yeah, and it evolved. And it's a bit like the application of the rules in relation to armed conflict. It was self-referential. And this is why the debate has opened up, and we know that the balancing of power, so it's just not brute force, has been a constant struggle in international law. And this is one of the reasons for codification, is to temper the impact of armed conflict. But unfortunately, and we know from colleagues that have spoken on the panel already, that didn't safeguard all peoples throughout the globe, especially during the 19th century. And we know that this is happening today. We can talk about
absolutely.
it. And that's why I brought it to the panel today as well. So
thank you so much, Anna. I'm very much educated by what you just spoke about. Mr. Kevin Gover, you were just recently involved in a major repatriation effort, or at least in terms of your affiliation with the Smithsonian. So the return of these Benin bronzes is the first return under the Smithsonian's new ethical returns policy announced this spring. And the policy authorizes Smithsonian museums to return collections to the community of origin based on ethical considerations, such as the manner and circumstances in which these items were originally acquired. So with your history of repatriation efforts and accomplishments at the Smithsonian, can you tell us about some of the considerations that museums must face when negotiating returns, and how the Smithsonian came to the decision that a policy such as this one was necessary? And if you could also maybe speak a little bit about the recent decision to repatriate the bronzes to Nigeria.
Sure. Thanks for having me this evening. To my eye, this business really began 30-some years ago, when Congress passed the act establishing the National Museum of the American Indian. And that act called for the Smithsonian to repatriate to Native American tribes human remains, sacred objects, and cultural patrimony that were in the collections of the Smithsonian, including the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History. And what was important about that was, of course, the acknowledgement by the Congress that wrongs had been carried out and that they should be corrected. But there was a lot of resistance to it at first, not within the Smithsonian so much, but in the museum world in general, who were very concerned that the tribes would basically do to them what they had done to the tribes, which is loot their collections and take all of their things. Now, that was never going to happen. And in fact, what happened instead was we learned that the transaction, this transfer of property, really was not at the heart of the matter. And what was really happening under our repatriation activities was that we were creating these new and thriving relationships with the tribes that we worked with as we pursued these repatriation claims. And we realized it was not so much a transfer of property as it was a mutual exchange of knowledge between the two parties, and therefore very valuable to us as well. Now, the NMAI Act that established the museum and the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act are really based upon ethical considerations very clearly. And as the museum world has evolved over these last few decades, and as the Smithsonian has evolved over these last few decades, we began to see that other museums and the staffs of those museums came to agree with the approach that the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History and other museums that were repatriating material to Native American tribes had been carrying out. And it was a very natural evolution, in part because new people, younger people, were coming into the museum world, and a new leadership was emerging. And that's certainly what happened at the Smithsonian. One of the key points, and you referenced our new policy, it's a policy we call shared stewardship and ethical returns. But shared stewardship is really at the heart of this. We are under no legal compulsion, as you just heard, to return items, especially internationally. With the Native American material, we are compelled by law to do so. But other than that, we're really under no compulsion so long as we hold title to the material. And under the legal regime, as was just described, we have good title under American laws. But under African law, probably not so much. And so that's why we have to begin to think about these things differently. Really, we had to come to acknowledge that the originating communities are due an ongoing role in the care and presentation of their cultural material. For far too long, museums took it upon themselves to serve as the experts about other cultures and to say, we've been studying, and so we understand this culture, and here's what's true about it. But they didn't bother to consult with members of that originating community. And so naturally, they got it wrong most of the time. Now, ethical returns is part of this shared stewardship obligation. And so we did adopt the policy in April. And here again, under the leadership of a new director at the National Museum of African Art, her name is Nairi Blankenberg, the National Museum of African Art was the first to act under our new policy of ethical returns. Now, but in fact, the process had been underway for some years. They had been carrying out provenance research. They had been engaging with both Nigeria and Benin. They were developing a memorandum of understanding between the parties. And the Smithsonian then was developing a process for evaluating these claims. We did have an internal process of review that was very thorough. The undersecretaries have to approve, then the secretary has to approve, and then even the Smithsonian Board of Regents has to approve because of the monetary value of this collection. So in the end, an agreement was signed last week between the Smithsonian and the Nigerian National Commission for Monuments, for Museums and Monuments. And under the terms of that agreement, title to 29 objects in our collections were transferred to the commission. However, as I said, it's about the relationship. And so they agreed that they would lend to us these items which we had just transferred to them, so that I think 9 or 10 of them will remain with us so that they can be displayed, because they want the rest of the world to see this, the art, the magnificence of this artistic tradition, and we're happy to have them. We also agreed we would work together on the interpretation of this material, and that we would work with the commission to develop an exhibition for display both here in the United States as well as in Nigeria. And finally, we're going to continue joint research on the provenance of the remaining items from Benin that we have in our collections. There are still more than 24 objects which are likely to be returned, but we want to go through the process and make sure we understand that they are, in fact, loot from the 1897 expedition. So in the end, this is not a program. This is not a project for us. but rather it's a matter of museum practice. This is how we're going to do our business with our collections from now on.
Wow, that radically changes the dynamics of care for curators. I'm thinking as well. I know that in my role at the Peabody, there is little or no collection activity and very much working within communities and working with descendant communities. And so the transformation of the encounter, the healing, is really what becomes the center for the curator today. And I see that, when you talk to me about policy and the Smithsonian and your long history with this policy for restitution and repatriation, I understand a lot more about the place that I am sitting in right now and the job that I am doing. So thank you so much. I have a follow-up question. I think just because you have just recently been through this process and there are so many questions about where things get repatriated to, right? Like there's a lot of discussion about who they get repatriated to and how did you come to that decision of where and to who the objects were repatriated?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is through conversation. Consulting with the government of Nigeria, who in turn turned the matter over to the Commission on Museums and Monuments. We also worked with the Kingdom, and the OBA there indicated to us that the Commission was authorized to negotiate on their behalf as well. So that's how it was resolved. If the two had not agreed, that would have made for a tough situation for us in trying to decide what to do. But our experience, again, when we are, I don't want to characterize it as generous, but when we are accommodating to these communities, to these other countries, to these tribal nations, that they too put their best foot forward and try to find solutions to problems that might have been vexing in the past, but because of the importance of this patrimony, they're willing to all work together.
Thank you so much, Mr. Grover. Appreciate that. Do we have there are a couple more questions we have. How much time do we have? 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm going to pose a couple more questions and I think that we can discuss depending on who wants to. But Anna, I have a question about international law, and it's just something that I'm curious about in terms of ethics and the law. How do we determine international laws when what is ethical may differ depending on one's cultural affiliation?
When I saw that question, I've got to say, Sarah, I was
a philosophical question.
No, I was a bit sort of perplexed because and it reminded me of debates that have been had in international law around human rights law, particularly in the Asian region where there was this idea about cultural relativity. And quite often people that are pushing back, we know of the nature of the countries that are pushing back against the universal application of those norms because they don't want to be judged by those. And quite often the people that are espousing them are the ones that are the most vulnerable. So I would probably dispute that I think there is, and that's why I started my intervention the way I did, is that there is more and more research around the way that practices in diverse regions of the world sing in a similar way. That is, that there is a recognition when there is a conflict or had been, and certainly we saw that I explained what the European situation was, and that was opportunistic. But in other regions, there was a prohibition against targeting cultural objects and spiritual objects of their combatants. So I think we need to explore whether there is that lack of basic norms across certain communities. So if there are diversity of views, and I am not accepting of them, the other thing that I'd like to, on the supposition of your question, was that quite often in claims around restitution, there is the idea that it's based on morality or ethics, and that there are no legal norms applicable. And that for a lawyer, I think is problematic. If you have a legal right, that is enforceable. And the people that have that legal right are on a stronger footing. So I think it's really behoved on us, particularly in the resources that we have now, is to explore the situation as it was. And don't just assume that there was no laws applicable, and critically look at the laws as they were being applied or not applied to the various combatants. And that's why I reiterated the British view of the application of the laws of conflict in the early 20th century. Yeah, it's very opportunistic. So I think we need to critically examine a lot of the assumptions that have been made over many decades around restitution claims. Sorry, that's a very long-winded question. Answer to your question.
I'm learning so much. But it brings me to another question that I have about this concept of whether something is ethical or legal or both, and what the differences are in that argument. There are diaspora groups more recently who are claiming a right to the ownership of the bronzes based on the fact that their ancestors were sold, or that the Benin Kingdom was complicit in the selling of their ancestors in the transatlantic slave trade. And the reason, and it's a very interesting, I think, topic, because the reason that they're claiming a right to the bronzes is because the currency that was used, the major currency, ingots and manillas of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa, there is some material that shows that these were possibly melted down. I don't want to make any claims because I'm not in the position to make any claims. Possibly melted down or contributed to the making of these bronzes. The reason why I bring this up, and it's a very contentious issue, is how would you prove that, or how would that then be understood legally? Is there a legal case there? I know it's a hard one, isn't it? Are you following what I'm saying?
I'm absolutely following. Yeah. And I didn't realize, and I really do not want to take up the panel's discussion.
This is for everyone.
No. What I would like to say, and I think there is absolutely an importance, and then I'll allow my colleagues to speak on the panel, is to not essentialize the claimant community. I think quite often there is an essentialization to acknowledge the diversity of that community, the complex nature of the history of these objects, both before and after, and also something that Karen raised, and I think that's certainly for the participants in the panel that I am in Australia, is certainly an issue within the Australian context of multiple claimants, is that also arises because of the colonial experience. Is that there is a diversity of claimants because of colonisation, because of the dislocation that various panellists have spoken about. And quite often that is leveraged by the holding institution or the collection or the collector that is trying to resist claimants, the claims for restitution. So I think we need to be very aware of the multiple aspects of this, including the very grey and problematic histories of a lot of these objects and multiple claimants.
That's well said. I think for us it was a matter of we didn't acquire these items from those descendants, that they were acquired from the kingdom, and if they have a claim, it should be asserted against the kingdom, rather than interfering in our relationship and our, if you will, chain of title that brought the bronzes into our possession. So it was a matter of, it's not as though we lack sympathy, of course, for the enslaved and their descendants. but we couldn't see a path, frankly, to acknowledge that claim.
Right.
I-
Inutie Sylvester. Yeah, Sylvester.
I'd like to point out that I don't see the claim as being frivolous. Very certainly, we do have evidence that the Benin Kingdom was paid in Manilas and that the brass from Manilas were used as part of this. But we have studies by Frank Willett showing that bronze casting in West Africa, in the Yoruba kingdoms, for example, which predate the slave trade, was already being carried out through the importation of, brass from the Mediterranean. So there's an issue there. As for the diaspora Africans and their dispossession, and they were dispossessed, in very fundamental ways, one recognizes that this is an important part of any conversations about repatriations. But I would like to point out that we're in a situation where we don't yet have an active agreement by Western countries, to actually pay any kind of repatriations to enslaved Africans, as we're talking here. No Western country has actually accepted the fact that they have to pay repatriations to enslaved Africans. And we're talking about this right now as the US is preparing to invade Haiti again. So this is something that claim needs to be foregrounded. And I'm taking a cue from your legal position issues here. That claim of repatriations to enslaved Africans needs to be a fight that is actually won or advanced very significantly, which would put diaspora Africans in a much better position to make any kind of claims against African kingdoms. In which case, the claims will be equally valid on the legalistic basis that we're discussing. There is no possible way to enforce that kind of claim because, charting a path of direct grievance and a path of direct responsibility is something that's almost impossible in this regard. You'd have to be able to trace your ancestry right back to the Benin Kingdom or environs, or prove that your ancestors were shipped out of Ugoton, which was a port in Benin, for this claim to have any. So I've always maintained right in all my discussions about these cultural patrimony issues that we're operating under legal statutes that, as Anne very clearly showed here, were designed to expropriate, the victims of these particular protocols. And the fact that you can very easily turn a kingdom like the Benin Kingdom into an uncivilized kingdom, considering the fact that it had actually been trading with major European powers since 1500. A Benin prince married a Portuguese, wife, and that led to a civil war in Benin City. And this was in 1505. So to consider that now an uncivilized kingdom because you wanted to take over the kingdom and control its trade routes and colonize its people, it's a continuum, in other words, is what I'm saying. And I agree with Kevin that for institutions here that are negotiating the return of objects in this manner, they do have to work within a very circumscribed space. The expanded capabilities of this negotiation and the initial actions can extend to other claims that are very legitimate and should be considered. Enslaved African diaspora peoples were dispossessed in fundamental ways. Africa bears some kind of responsibility for that. And for the African rulers who participated in this, they bear some kind of responsibility for that. But shall we begin by having, the United States, for example, pay reparations, to its African American population? Shall we begin by having Britain pay reparations to Caribbean communities and other places where, so this is just how I want to see this conversation go. Otherwise, we end up with a lot of spurious claims, and those contending claims then dispossess both Africans and African diaspora people in general.
Yes. Thank you, Sylvester. What I'm amazed about, I continue to be amazed, is the way in which the Benin bronzes connect so many different people. This is yet another connection and another, I feel, opportunity for healing, because what I hear is that there is a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain that occurred with the 1897 expedition. And there is now this pain that is being brought to the forefront of people of African descent, the descendant communities, and the ways in which they are connected to the bronzes and to Nigeria culture as well. So I think if we can look at this as a way to form pathways for healing and, maybe challenge and change the encounter in the future, that's really what I'm hearing more than anything else. So Sylvester, you've mentioned in the past that there are several alternative ways to conceive of repatriation. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is transferring ownership to descendant communities in Nigeria before or in lieu of immediate return of objects to Nigeria. So can you share some of your thoughts on that issue with us?
Yes. Kevin just gave us a very good example of how a negotiated, solution was reached by which the rights to the objects were transferred to the Benin Kingdom. And then the Benin Kingdom was able to negotiate a kind of lease agreement with the Smithsonian, whereby the Smithsonian kept some of the objects. This, frankly speaking, is one of the most enlightened approaches I've heard for quite a long time. But that was what I had always preached in my writing about this restitution issue. The issue at stake here is not the objects themselves. Objects were remade in Benin, right after the invasion ended, and the son of the deposed king, when he was about to come to power, he, had new objects made so that the altars can be rebuilt. Objects have been remade, but the invasion and the discourse that emerged around it has rendered all the objects made in Benin since 1897 outside of the Benin art canon, which shows that the impact of that continues to affect. So I had always argued that what we're struggling over here is the, ownership of the intellectual property rights of these objects. And that once you are able to secure ownership of the intellectual property rights of the objects, arrangements can be made with institutions to either return, hold, or lease the objects based on agreed, discussions between the owner communities and these institutions. That was what was not done when Macron came into this discussion. He cut that avenue off by making this just an issue of returning objects. So if you return the objects, but the digital rights are not in your possession, you are losing you are returning actual objects without returning the value of the objects along with it. And so there are many ways in which we can look at this and understand that the restitution issue is not just about the physicality of the objects. We're talking about the ancillaries, that accrue to these objects in their production of value. And that's what I've always been interested in securing. So if you secure the intellectual property rights of an object, as with the Native American Grave Repatriation Act, you can determine how that object is displayed or not displayed. You can you can have an influence on the discourse around the object, around its modes of presentation and its modes of, engagement with the wider world. But if you don't have those rights, then the objects can be manipulated in ways that you don't have any control over. When I give lectures about this, I use the example of digital reproductions of objects and the fact that we're all moving into a kind of digital environment in which actual museums, even though they will continue to be important, will be increasingly displaced, by the digital manipulation and manifestations of these objects. If you don't own those rights, to digital representation, then your ownership of the actual objects themselves becomes something of a joke.
Yeah.
To be realistic about it, do we really expect that vast hordes of people from Europe will be traveling to the Benin Kingdom to see the Benin bronzes on location? This is not something that's likely to happen immediately. So we need to think about these things on a much kind of larger conceptual framework.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I have one last question, and it's for Enote. Do you feel comfortable maybe sharing with us a little bit about what you're working on at the University of Cambridge, and will this coming exhibition, be an intervention in the British Museum? How are you? Are you interacting at all with the Benin bronzes in the British Museum?
I note your microphone is off.
Oh yes, the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so basically, what I'm doing, there are two different projects. I have a 2-year residency with the Cambridge University, where I'm looking at the bronze collections and looking at the Benin artifacts in their collection
Mm-hmm.
and how this relates to environmental issues. You see a lot of the bronze plaques and a lot of the bronze works indicate animals, trees, birds. And today, a lot of those animals are extinct, at least in our forests and in our bushes. And how they were able to maintain this maintain a balance in the delicate ecosystem to ensure longevity, because you find the recurrent motifs of the same animals over the centuries in these works. And all the way up to the 19th century, there are still reports and accounts of leopards and elephants and all of that. And today, we only have about 13 elephants left in the bushes in the kingdom, or in the territory that used to be the kingdom. Leopards have been wiped out. The white-throated monkey was almost wiped out. And there are lots of other animals like that that are in danger of extinction. And when it comes to trees, this was the heart of the rainforest. So you had huge 200-year-old trees and 300-year-old trees, massive timber. Today, you can't find any of that because they've all been cut down. The few remaining forest reserves are also under serious attack. And so while we're talking about repatriation of artifacts, we also have to look at the multiplier effect of the invasion of 1897, how this fractured the society and resulted in this. The imposition of the colonial administration was only for ones and the produce and the labor, and ship them out straight without recourse to maintaining our environment. And so this practice has led to a decimation of our environment on the one hand. And then my other topic, the project with the British Museum, really is about illegal trafficking and migration. Because while we're talking about the artifacts and talking about repatriation and restitution, we also have to look at the relationship between the present-day economic realities in our country and in our communities, and how they are tied to the apron strings of the colonizers, and how this colonial intervention has left a system which has resulted in mediocre leadership being imposed post-colonialism, and how the economic practices and the instability and the unfair trade practices and all of that has resulted in an economic situation which has left our country in such a state that the young people, who make up about 60 to 70% of the population, are all finding desperate ways to just leave the country in search of greener pastures. They're so desperate, they're willing to trek through the desert, they're willing to risk their lives on rubber dinghies to cross the Mediterranean and all of this. And what's the response? The response are gunboats waiting to drive them back or prevent them from crossing. There are all kinds of refugee camps and all kinds of programs. And so the thinking is there's a call for immigrants in Europe. There's a call for immigrants in the UK. There's a call for immigrants in America. There's a call for immigrants in Canada, in Australia, in different countries all over the world. So instead of investing in gunboats and in all kinds of facilities to prevent these young immigrants from crossing, I feel that direct interventions and investments should be made on the continent of Africa so that these young people can be upskilled, they can be equipped, so they can hop on a plane and fly over and become assets instead of going through the desert and risking their lives and going through the Mediterranean and becoming liabilities. And today we have a huge population of depressed mothers, wives, sisters, relatives back in Benin City who have not heard from over 10,000 children, uncles, fathers, relatives who have left to seek greener pastures, but who have ended up dead in the desert or drowned in the Mediterranean. And so these are things that are the reality of now, of today. So I'm also trying to make sure that the narrative is diversified. And in that process, draw the linkages back to the events of 1897 and also get some discussion going on about this in the British Museum and in Europe and everywhere else.
Great. That is a fantastic project. And I think fittingly, we end with a contemporary Benin artist who is making a link between what we know under the umbrella of the Benin bronzes and contemporary issues in present day Nigeria with his art. And you're going to be presenting. When is your exhibition?
It's in July next year.
It's in July of 2023.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll all be looking out for it. So I think I'm going to close now. We've had a wonderful conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to all of you, but I've also just learned so much. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your information, your cultural knowledge. This is just really what I think these kind of encounters are supposed to be about. So I honor you and I respect you. And I'm so just really pleased to have had this moment to interact with you and with the audience here as well at the Low in Miami. So I want to say goodbye. Any last words?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for having me on this conversation, on this panel. I've learned a lot also from the fellow panelists. It's been, to learn about the legal aspects and to see comparisons in laws and conditions which have led to restitution in America and everywhere else. And thank you also to Sylvester for drawing the linkages within the kingdom and with our history and state. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all very, very much. And I know that everyone's on different time zones, so that's a huge additional challenge as well. So I appreciate it so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Anotia.
Thank you to all. Thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye and good night or good morning.
Good day.